Well, another very warm welcome back, all my vintage dirt bike YouTubers, and thanks once again to each and every one of you for returning to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, it won't be too long before we hit that elusive 12,000 subscriber total, and I must admit that when I started this channel many years ago, I never ever thought that we would have almost 12,000 subscribers by 2021, but thanks to each and every one of you for your continuing support of my YouTube channel. Okay, coming up in this next video, we're going to take a look at another machine that was built by Keith Ree. Now, this particular bike was made up from spare parts taken from Terry Pickering's massive collection of old dirt bike parts, and Terry then gave the parts to Keith Ree to restore this machine. So we're going to take a look at this lovely looking 1979 Maico 125. Now, these little Maico 125s are a bit of an enigma really when it comes to their history, as not a lot is actually known about these 125s other than they were hugely expensive for a 125, and very few were actually made, and I think even fewer were sold. So these two factors certainly go to explain why you very seldom see these rare 125 Maicos taking to a racetrack, and the ones that have survived are usually show bikes, as is this example of Terry's. But once again, this lovely bike is another product from the very skilled hands of Terry's bike building friend Keith Ree, who has performed an excellent rebuild on this bike, but it's not as an original 79 125 was from back in the day, as it has a couple of non-original parts fitted to it. But nonetheless, it's still a very nice representation of one of these extremely rare German Maicos. Now, most Maico motocross frames down the years are pretty much standardised in their diameter and construction, although it's said that these 125s had a slightly narrower diameter tubing, and the motor's engine mountings were slightly different to its bigger brothers. But other than that, this was still basically a 79 standard Maico chassis. Now, although these 125s were still considered the baby of the Maico motocross range, it still used the bigger forks from the larger bikes. Now, the front brake hub was also the standard unit from the bigger Maico range, so if these older drum brake systems were good enough to slow down maybe a 250 or 400 Maico, then this little 125 would certainly cope without much fuss. But these hubs were a certainly tried and tested unit, and they were pretty good, as these old braking systems were back in 1979. And again, this bike is fitted with a pair of Spanish-made Acront rims, but of course the spokes have all been renewed during this rebuild. Now, I have to admit that I've absolutely no idea what kind of rear shocks Maico would have fitted to these little 125s back in 1979, although the bigger 400s certainly had the Italian Corticossos fitted as standard for that year, although this quite nice pair that Keith's now supplied for this bike looked like a better quality set than the originals from back in 79. Now, almost straight away you can see that this little 125 two-stroke motor is radically different from previous Maicos, and this particular little engine uses this very innovative rotary disc valve fuel induction system, whereby the fuel comes from the carburetor and then a small rotating fibre disc on the end of the right hand side of the crankshaft then passes a cutout on the engine casing, and then the fuel air mixture is then sucked into the crankcase. And actually this particular induction system, as I remember as a youngster, it was used on some of the 1970s Yamaha road bikes to good effect. As I recall, my old Yamaha FS1E50 and my Yamaha YB100 had this very same induction system. And of course, by using this particular induction system, Maico could then mount the carb on the side of the motor, and it was quite an easy job just to change jets or do any mixture adjustments on that quite large Bing carburetor. Although in terms of their power output, these were still pretty good little two-stroke motors, although much of their mechanical problems were usually confined to the transmission area of the engine. Now, breakages and other gearbox troubles were not uncommon on these 125 Maicos, and a lot of the criticism was targeted at the selector part of the gear change system. Now, the kickstart and the gear lever basically shared the same shaft. Well, actually, the kickstart part of the shaft was actually hollow, and then the gear selector shaft ran through the inside of it. But other things like dodgy selector mechanisms just added to the bike's troublesome transmission problems. Now, the little Maico 125's alloy fuel tank is again the very same fuel tank that's used on the bigger 79 motocross machines, and these fuel cells, for me personally, I think are one of the better looking Maico tanks in their motocross range. Now, of course, Maico a year later would then ditch these alloy fuel tanks and start using plastic tanks on their 1980 models. Now, the bike's seat, once again, is the standard part across the 79 model range, and this rear frame loop was always a dead giveaway that you were looking at a 79 Maico motorcycle. Now, one of the other things that is slightly different on these little 125 Maicos compared to the bigger engine bikes is the size of this rear brake hub, which is slightly smaller in diameter than the bigger engine bikes, but nevertheless this is still a very effective little stopper, and certainly good enough to slow down this particular 125 into the corners. Now, once again, a quite small rear sprocket on the back of this bike, which is more than likely just to keep the gearing absolutely correct for that Maico gearbox. But the steel swing arm and its attachments are all basically interchangeable from this little 125 onto many of the bigger Maicos in the range. Now, this Maico's expansion chamber exhaust system is not an original part from 1979, as this pipe is made by Saito, who make all manner of exhaust pipes for just about every conceivable make and model of motorcycle. But this pattern exhaust certainly fits and looks great on this little bike, and will more than likely be a much better upgrade to what was on the bike originally. But the rear tailpipe, I have to say, it looks like the correct part for this 79 125, so the bike has still retained quite a lot of its factory bits and pieces from way back in the day. Now, once more, it certainly looks like the proper handlebars are fitted to our 125, although I'm not sure if these were actually painted red originally, but they still give the bike that certain 70s look. Now, a good set of Magura levers and their associated covers, and of course a nice Gunnar Gasser throttle just to try and control that little 125 motor. Now the clutch lever again is a Magura part, and it didn't take a lot of effort to pull in the clutch on this relatively light little 125. Now it's quite well documented that back in 1979 these little 125 Maicos were selling for over $1,000 in the USA, which was an awful lot of money for a European motocross race bike, especially when you consider that at the time you could buy an equivalent KX125 Kawasaki for only $650, which is probably one of the other reasons that these German 125s never sold in big numbers, and also more than likely why you never actually see any taking part in vintage motocross events in this modern day. Although the 79 125 Maicos were the last year that they made these 125s, and because they only made a limited amount and actually sold even less, then this makes these particular 125 Maicos very rare and extremely collectible. Although summing up, these weren't really bad bikes. They had a well-proven Maico chassis. They of course had good suspension taken from its bigger siblings, and of course that little 125 motor was by all accounts a little belter, but unfortunately not without its problems. Now, although this is not a fully blown original example from 1979, it's still a good piece of Maico history, and again another very worthwhile addition to Terry's very comprehensive collection of vintage race machines. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that nice look around Terry Pickering's latest addition to his classic dirt bike collection. That's his 1979 Maico 125, a quite rare machine, and of course a bike that was put together by the very talented hands of Keith Ree. Okay, we're going to take a break for a week or two from uploading videos, because we're going to make preparations to head down to Kendal to the Westmoreland Motor Club's big 2-day CCM extravaganza. Now this will be a full weekend of classic racing, and of course CCM bikes in particular, and over the course of that weekend we'll bring you all the bikes from the paddock, and of course every race that happened over the course of the weekend. So in order that you don't miss out on this fantastic weekend, please hit that subscribe button, and that way as soon as you're a subscriber, every time I upload a new video, you will be the first person to be notified. So please subscribe. Okay, until the next time, everybody continue to be safe and well, and we'll all get back here once again to show you all the footage from that 2-day CCM event right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.